Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of We're Gonna Need a Bigger Show. This is a very special episode today. Not only do we have a special guest, but we are also co-presenting today's interview with Chattanooga's own Vitamin Geek podcast and...
Cory Keelen.
Cory, thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's awesome.
Absolutely, man. And as I said, today we have a very special guest, Mr. Joe Bob Briggs. Sir, thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
So we're here at the Chattanooga Film Festival again, and last night you gave a lecture. Can you talk a little bit about how that went?
Yeah, let's not call it a lecture. That sounds
Okay.
a little too academic.
Okay.
I showed a lot of film clips and showed a lot of visuals on that. We did the whole history of the South in film. The history of it was more the history of how Hollywood portrays the South in film.
Sure.
For starting in 1904 with a movie that was shot in Scarsdale, New York, called The Moonshiner. It was supposed to be Kentucky, but it's shot in Scarsdale, New York. And continuing up through the horrors of modern time, and all the lame KKK movies that are made today. We talked a lot about the KKK.
That was one of the things you were talking about with exploitation films. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, one of the questions I thought of, exploitation is definitely not as prominent as it was in the 70s, but modern exploitation, in my personal opinion, feels meaner than it used to. It used to have kind of a little more whimsy than it does to me now. What are your thoughts on kind of modern exploitation?
What are you talking
films?
about? Torture porn? Stuff like that?
Well, I guess so. I'm more like the indie kind of... I was trying to think of some examples. I picked up a bunch of films at a horror con about a month ago, and they were just things I wouldn't imagine ever putting on film. But it just seemed like a lot more visceral than the older.
Well, you have to remember that the word exploitation was an industry word. It was used by the filmmakers themselves. It meant it's what was later called high concept, which means it's a marketing term. It means exploitable. It means the idea of the film, the simple idea of the film, and the poster are exploitable, and you can sell it. So. Exploitation was a good word to them because exploitation was their word for marketing.
Sure.
Okay.
And so now the reason that it became associated with the B movie is that in the 50s and 60s you had a two-tiered distribution system. You had the major studios controlled the major theaters, and then you had the drive-ins and the grindhouses, and those needed product. And in order to lure people away from the bigger budget movies, they had to be exploitable. So those were called exploitation movies. And what happens is, those were made, especially the grindhouses, those were made for what they called the raincoat crowd, and especially the sex-based films, which were very mild for the time. They weren't what we would call real porn, but they're made for the raincoat crowd. And then the drive-ins were sort of the home of horror and low-budget sci-fi and the teen movie, which was kind of invented at the drive-in. And so you've got all these genres developing, and then after the two-tiered system goes away, a whole different audience comes and starts watching exploitation films. The audience that appreciates exploitation films today is not the same audience as the films were designed to satisfy.
Sure.
So there's two different ways to look at these films, and the hipsters and the geeks of the last 30 years look at it in an ironic way. They look at the exploitation films in an ironic way. It's the same way you look at pro wrestling. They appreciate it. They appreciate the show. They appreciate the showmanship. They appreciate the cheesiness. Whereas somebody watching Blood Feast in 1965, he's watching it as a straight narrative movie.
Right.
Okay.
He's pulling into the drive-in and he's hoping that it's going to make him puke. So and he didn't know the difference between low budget, high budget, exploitation. Those differences don't exist. So, but to answer your question, today there's every kind of movie that could possibly exist. Now, when the technology to make movies got so cheap, about 15 years ago, I thought it would lead to hundreds, if not thousands, of great exploitation movies that you couldn't find anywhere else. Just on the simple principle of if you have 10 million monkeys typing, they'll eventually type, Hamlet. So I thought, but that has not happened. Right. I mean, I can tell you, that has not happened. I mean, those guys need to go back to film school.
Right. Well, one of the things you say on your website, I mean, you'll say that you'll watch, you'll review stuff and, you'll look at scripts and stuff. I mean, do you think that the idea that technology is more readily available is detrimental to film?
No. Technology being cheap is good for film. What's bad for film is filmmakers who don't bother to art direct their scene, to
right.
script their scene, to cast it with professional actors. I mean, it's the filmmaker's fault. And they say, well, we didn't have any money. Well, you didn't do any good. You didn't do the things that don't cost any money, like fixing the script. You didn't do those things right either, So we didn't have enough money. Doesn't matter, I say, why did you put your cousin in the film? Who's a non-actor.
Sure.
Well, we didn't have any money. Where do you live? Lawrence, Kansas. Don't they have a university there? Yes. Don't they have a drama department in that university? Don't they have like at least 150 people who have been trained to act and who would love to act in a movie? It's like, show a little bit of initiative, Yeah. I don't care where you are. There's a community college somewhere near you with some actors in it.
Sure. Well, I mean, to kind of back up then, I guess, growing up, I mean, were you film obsessed growing up? I mean, was that a thing that happened for you, or did that come later on?
That came later on. I was not film obsessed. I was aware of films, and I loved films, and I went to films. And when I was a kid, my birthday party was always a film party. We would go see whatever was hot at the time, and as sexual as we were allowed to see.
Sure.
As we got older and older, we could see more and more, sex in the film. But really. What happened is, I won't bore you with the early details of my career, but I got to a point where I was trying to finish a true crime book. I was writing a true crime book, and I needed a job where I didn't have to travel all the time. And so a friend of mine was an entertainment editor at the Dallas Times-Herald, and she needed a film critic. And I said, can I be the film critic? And she said, sure, why do you want to be the film critic? And at the time, I didn't know that it was so hard to become a film critic,
Sure.
And so I said, well, I love films. I've always loved films. And she says, do you know you have to watch everything? And I said, yeah. I said, that's what appeals to me about it, that I can just like go to the screening room, go home, do this job.
Sure.
So I became the regular film critic, not the and I was reviewing every movie that came out, and most of them were Hollywood blockbusters, and I just hated them. I just didn't enjoy myself at all. And then occasionally there would be weird European art films that would show up in town, and I loved those. And the great thing about European films that end up over here is so few of them end up over here that we only get the good ones.
Sure.
It's like we get the 1 out of 100, right. that has international appeal. And so,
can you remember any of the early ones that you saw?
Well, I remember one in particular that a friend of mine that ran the Inwood Theater, which was the indie art house in Dallas, named Bob Burney, who would later go on to be a famous distributor. He actually ended up distributing the 2 top indie films of all time, which were The Passion of the Christ and My Big Fat Greek Wedding. He distributed both of those. But at the time, he was the manager of the local indie theater. And one year we went to the Cannes Film Festival together, and I saw this really intense, depressing, 4-part. It was 4 stories in one, Turkish film called Yole. It had a bad name. It was depressing. And for some reason, I loved it. It was just mesmerizing. And I said, Bob, did you watch Yole? And he said, yeah. And I said, have you ever shown a Turkish film? And he says, no. I said, you ever shown a film that's depressing? Probably not. I said, if you'll find the rights to this film, you know, I'll review it for the paper, because I think people will go to this film. He says, why do you think people will go to this film? It's like, it's Turkish. It's Turkish people. And it's Turkish people in prison. And, you know, it's like Midnight Express was depressing enough. This is more depressing than Midnight Express, because
Sure.
it's like the real Turkish prison. And so we went back to Dallas, and he got the rights to it. And I wrote this review, and it like set box office records only in Dallas. Only in Dallas. And it's like, and other distributors around the country were saying, what is that? Yole. It's Yole. It's called Yole, Y-O-L, you know, and no one ever knew what it was or why it performed like that. It was like this blip on the screen there. But anyway, the two kinds of movies I liked were the foreign movies and the exploitation movies. Now, I quickly discovered that there were a lot of movies that were premiering at the drive-in that were never screened for the critics. And so I was like calling up the distributors, and they would say, we don't screen those movies. We don't let critics see those movies. All except one guy, Roger Corman. And Roger said, you want to see my movie? He said, you know, go to this theater on Wednesday afternoon, my old friend, whatever, he'll run it for you, you know. And so I started out reviewing Roger's movies. We kind of thought that I was going to get in trouble when I started writing the column. The column was called Joe Bob Goes to the Drive-In. And so we buried it in this Friday section that came out. This Friday section had about 60 pages. This is where all the discount furniture ads were, and it was greasy, and the ink came off on your hands. So we put it like back on page 54. So mainly because we knew that editors don't read their own papers.
Right.
And so we could get it started without any editor really calling attention to it. I had one editor that was on my side, and we were like plotting to do this. And by about the third month, it was getting massive amounts of mail, and I knew that it was like, now it was too hot for them to kill it.
Right.
And so that's how it started. And increasingly, the other distributors would let me see their movies. And when we're talking about the days of really, really low rent distributors, I mean, a lot of them were in, you know, illegal buildings in Marina Del Rey, and there was this one guy, Lon Kerr, motion picture marketing. I would call up Lon and I would say, Lon, Eager Beavers, have I seen that? And he would say, yeah, you saw that last year. It was Swinging Stewardesses. And he said, I'm putting it out again. I said, okay, I didn't want to waste my time. Yeah.
So, in order to be able to talk about these kind of films, you created Joe Bob. And so, what was the transition to television? How did that come about?
In 1985, or 1986, I can't remember now, whenever they filmed Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, I went down to Austin for the filming to write an article for Rolling Stone magazine, because Rolling Stone magazine wanted an article on, it was Dennis Hopper's comeback. He'd been a drunk, and he got sober, and he probably more than a drunk. I mean, he had substance abuse problems, and now he got sober, and he was back. And so I was going down there to do this piece on Dennis Hopper, and Toby Hooper finds out I'm going down there and knows that I'm the world's biggest supporter of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the writer of the movie, Kit Carson, who had also written Paris, Texas, said to me, you know, why don't we write you a couple scenes while you're down here? So we wrote a couple scenes, and I hung around the set for a long time. This article came out, and then the people at the movie channel saw the article, and they said, you know, we buy all these cheap movie packages from Europe that we don't know what to do with. And so what we'll do is we'll have a hosting segment on Friday night.
In
we'll
true horror host fashion.
Yeah, we'll try this guy out. They were cheap.
Sure.
The movie channel was very, very cheap. And so they wanted simple solutions for programming. So the idea was to put me in a chair in front of the screen.
Right.
And I wasn't the only one, by the way. They hired 4 hosts for different types of movies. And it's supposed to be for 1 month. And then after the month, they invited me back for a second month, then a third month. I don't think we ever signed a contract. I just kept coming back. And then they started firing the other hosts. And by the end of the first year, or the second year, they fired everybody except me and Robert Osborne. And by the end of the second year, Robert Osborne was filming his stuff somewhere else.
Sure.
And I was in this big empty studio in Spanish Harlem, where they used to film The Honeymooners.
Right.
And in fact, the Joe Bob set we were using was a painted over flat from The Honeymooners. And
That's crazy.
and I said, I don't really need to be coming up here to this big empty set, once a month. I'll just shoot this in Dallas, and I can probably do it like a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
And so we moved the show to Dallas, and Ross Perot had built this big fancy studio that he was going to use for his presidential campaign. And it was the fanciest TV studio I've ever seen in my life. And nobody wanted to use it. For a while, Barney the dinosaur used it, but then they moved out, and so nobody used it except me and Ross Perot. And in fact, if you remember Ross Perot's presidential campaign, he stood in front of a chart and had a pointer, and he pointed at like how the budget was getting out of control or whatever. Well, that chart and that pointer were like just off camera from the Joe Bob's Drive-In set. I was here, he was over there, and we didn't ever have to worry about him because he hated to be on TV. So he would like rush in, and everyone would freak out, that he was going to get bored before they could get to all the shots that they needed, and then he would be gone, and then we would shoot. So anyway, I ended up being on the movie channel for I think 9 years. Yeah, 9 years, and that's 52 weeks a year. That's
Sure.
a double feature, sometimes a triple feature, sometimes things I was doing on Showtime as well. So that's how that whole thing started. It started with Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2.
Wow.
That's awesome.
What was the transition to Monster Vision? How did they approach you for that? And I mean,
Well, they were going to have a format change at the movie channel, and they didn't need me anymore. And so we did our final show, and
what was the final show? Do you remember?
I don't remember what movie it was,
Okay.
but I remember at the end of it, I took off the hat and I laid it down in the chair. And the last shot they pushed in.
Down on the hat.
They pushed in on the hat and the empty chair. So that was the final shot of Joe Bob's Drive-In Theater. And then I was only off the air. This was just a pure lucky break. There were 2 programmers at TNT who liked Joe Bob.
Uh-huh.
And so they said, what would you think about coming on our show, which already existed, Monster Vision. They had other hosts come on, the guest hosts. So the same thing as history repeating itself, come be a guest host. And so I went as a guest host, and I within a matter of months, we just said, hey, you know what, I've got all these sets and all this stuff, in Dallas. You want to shoot in Dallas? And they were like, yeah, let's shoot in Dallas. So we just went right back and started doing it again. Now the Monster Vision shows were more complicated because there's a very complicated formula for where you put the commercials in a TV movie. I don't know if you've paid attention to it. You probably have, but the first when a TV movie starts, it goes for anywhere from 17 to 23 minutes. You have that much of the movie before the first commercial. And then as you get closer to the end of the movie, the commercials get closer and closer and closer together. That's why it's so annoying to watch a movie on TV. Because it's, once you're hooked and you've got to know how it ends, that's when the commercials start.
Load them down.
So that's the tried and true way of doing it. Well,
Sure.
Now we're going to add another annoying thing, which is a guy talking as soon as the commercial segment starts.
Right.
The great thing about that show, and I don't think it'll ever be repeated. I don't think any network would do it today. Because the great thing about that show is we had no time constraints whatsoever. We would do 2 movies a night, and whenever we finished, that's when we finished. They would show, they would fill in with whatever they had to fill in with until 6 a.m. when the programming cycle started again.
Right.
So as long as we were done by 6 a.m., we could finish at 3 a.m., we could finish at 5 a.m., they didn't care. So I didn't ever have to worry about how long the segment was.
Right.
Which is a great freedom for something like that, because when you're trying to hit 45 seconds exactly or something, I can do it, but it's not going to be as good as if I can just talk. And
Right.
So that was the wonderful thing about those guys, is that they let me do that. And but eventually that was killed too by, again, a format change where they wanted to be more women friendly. At TNT. They wanted to have a female demographic, and my show was very, very male.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It had a high male demographic.
Is that when they started the We Know drama or whatever their tagline?
Yeah, I think it was shortly after that. I remember they were real proud of themselves for buying up ER reruns.
Yeah.
So.
One of the things you said, you don't think that they would ever, do anything like that again. I mean, has there ever been a conversation about bringing Monster Vision back, or you doing something online?
Yeah,
or,
I had one recently actually with a guy who wants to do it for syndication,
Okay.
and so I don't know if syndication exists, but but you used to be able to do shows on syndication, and I would be up for it. I mean,
Sure.
I don't think people know how much planning it takes to be that spontaneous.
Right.
And so it's kind of a pain in the butt production schedule on those, because a lot of times they weren't deciding what the movies were until the last minute, and it was before there was much information easily available online, and
So you didn't decide what the films were?
the way that would work is at the beginning of the year, I would go through everything that they owned, and I would tell them what I wanted to show.
Sure.
Now, a lot of stuff they would just rule out automatically because it was either too old or it was in black and white. So, for example, they own Todd Browning movies. They own Freaks, and they would never show it because they thought it was, too old and black and white. They didn't really like to show anything that was more than 15 years old.
Sure.
They would occasionally. Occasionally we would have, as the second feature, we could show something a little bit more weird. But then they would also acquire things that they didn't own, but they would have the licensing for them for the future. Now that's the bad part of it, because what they would do is they would program this stuff that they'd bought. But when you go to a film market, and you want a certain film, the guy who's selling the film says, "I'll sell you this film if you buy 15 others." And so they end up coming back with this package of films, and they only wanted one of them. Now, what are we going to do with these other 15? Well, you're going to give them to Joe Bob, And so that's how you end up with films like Super Beast. I don't know if you remember Super Beast, but it was a Filipino monster movie, but you never really see the monster.
Right.
It's just people wandering around in the jungle for an hour and a half, Horrible film. You wonder how it ever gets on TV, And the same thing had happened at the movie channel too, because they would buy these packages of European softcore sex films. first of all, the softcore sex film. What is the point? You know? but in the 80s, there was this kind of film, the West German sex film, because the West Germans, every country had its own softcore porn. The worst was England. I mean, England's idea of porn was, you know, naked guys running down the street like Benny Hill. The Adventures of a Plumber's Mate. That was one of the movies that we actually showed. You know. And then the Italian films were always about dirty old men and Catholic schoolgirls.
Right.
And then so the ones that played well were the kinkiest ones, which was the Germans. And there was one that always got a huge rating, and it was called "She's 19 and Ready."
Oh.
And she wasn't 19; she was about 35, and she wasn't that ready either. But the title "She's 19 and Ready," it would always score. So they kept running it over and over and over again. I'm running out of stuff to say about "She's 19 and Ready," other than that she's not 19 anymore. You know, because we've been showing this movie for so many years.
That's great. Well, we've only got just a few minutes left. Cory, I know you had a few things that you want to talk about.
He actually got two of mine in one earlier. That was impressive.
Yeah, that's not.
You have a third eye for questions. This is kind of more for you as a fan. Obviously, you've enjoyed watching some of these movies. So, being a fan of horror films, there's been a huge, I guess, popularity surge in zombie fiction over the past, I would say, 5-6 years, maybe a little longer. Every city's got a zombie walk. The Walking Dead is watched by millions of people. You know,
right.
What do you think has caused that? Because it's definitely not a new thing.
No, it's fairly. I've seen a lot of horror fads come and go. They always come back. The great thing about the horror genre is it endlessly renews itself.
Sure.
Right.
So things that go out of fashion come back in fashion. You know, there's cycles. When I first started writing about horror films, there were maybe 5 zombie films, 5 in history.
Sure.
You know, including White Zombie and that French one, and Night of the Living Dead was, of course, the most famous one. But, you know, 5. And so I think the one that started the zombie craze, the person I give credit to is Sam Raimi. I think Evil Dead brought back the zombie. Mm-hmm. And other young filmmakers wanted to make that sort of movie. That was an incredible achievement by Sam Raimi, because he was shooting on 16 millimeter film, editing it on a flatbed, doing the effects in his attic. He didn't have any money, so he had to steal the equipment, borrow the equipment from Michigan State. And so everything about that movie was, you know, a labor of love, and he brought back the zombie. I actually think Evil Dead 2 is the better film.
Absolutely.
But that's because he had some money for,
right.
For the second one. But so that started it rolling. But to tell you the truth, it's sort of entered. We're talking about two different things, because we're talking about the films and we're talking about sort of zombie subculture. Right. Zombie subculture is more like a haunted house attraction. It's like going to a haunted house in Niagara Falls. It's like it's like a lot of the zombie walks and everything. That's about the makeup. That's about Halloween. That's
sure.
about a social event. It doesn't really have that much to do with the films, other than that they're copying the makeup from the films. And it's a good thing and a bad thing. It's always good if you have intense interest in a genre. It's bad if the filmmakers don't innovate and take it to the next and turn it and combine genres and do new things with it. And of course, as we all know, the most innovative people in that field right now are on TV. They're not in film.
Absolutely.
I would like to see some of the films come back to it. I've been predicting for 5 years, 8 years that it's peaked, and it still hadn't peaked. So I don't know. I can't explain it.
The thing that you say, you said innovation, and one of the things that Cory and I had talked about, is, there's just a glut of remakes and reboots and, these kind of things. What do you think that'll go out of fashion? It just seems like it's never ending.
No, anything that makes money is never going to go out of fashion.
Sure.
The making of motion pictures is just one step away from a Turkish bazaar. It's all about, making it cheap and selling it expensive. And so the guys who make decisions, whether they're on the indie level or the micro budget level or the studio level, actually the studio level usually is taking its lead from the indie level because they don't really watch the films. The studio execs don't really watch these films. So what they do is they see who's popular in the indie world. They give them insanely good contracts.
Sure.
And so that's how Sam Raimi becomes a studio guy, instead of an indie guy. And the film that was shown opening night here, A Woman Walks Alone at Night. The director already has a $30 million movie. That's her first movie. Now she's got a $30 million contract because she made the first Iranian vampire film.
Did you see it?
I did see it.
What did you think of it?
I thought it fell apart in about 60% in.
Okay.
I thought it was very, very gripping at the beginning. I thought the cinematography was beautiful. That black and white cinematography is really hard to do. I thought it was very effective. It was exactly what was needed for that story. And then I thought that she started repeating herself in what the zombies do and how they relate. What the characters do and how they relate. By the time we got to the end, I was not as excited about it as I had been in, say, the first. I was going to say it's a third act problem. I think it's an end of the second act problem, actually, for those screenwriters that are listening. It's the end of the second act. She made a mistake, in my opinion. And so to me, it's a brilliant student film. And I think that's exactly what it was. I think she made it at the Sundance Institute. She is a film student. It's a student film. It's not going to get wide distribution. It's going to go to art houses.
So I guess to kind of finish up, and speaking of that film, what are you watching now? What are some of the things in the last few years or even just this year that you've really liked?
Well, I've actually been busy starting a film studio, so I haven't been able to watch anything. Well, as I said before, all the good stuff is on TV. All the stuff is on is on the TV channels, and so and that's exciting. And the reason that's exciting is that talk about story arcs. Those are 16-hour, 32-hour, 48-hour miniseries.
Sure.
We would have to put paper all over this room to chart the plots of some of these shows. Now, that's sort of why they start to fail in the third season or the fourth season. They don't necessarily fail commercially, but people start to say, oh, I feel like I've seen something similar to this in a previous season, because you simply cannot sustain a story arc. I forget the name of that. Fassbinder, the director Fassbinder in Germany in the 80s made a 9-hour movie, which at the time, was analyzed, and people said, well, he almost pulled it off, but that's about as far as you can go with a single story arc.
Sure.
So you have to, I think that's why, I think that's probably the technical reason why They chose to do American Horror Story the way they do it, because then they don't have that problem.
Sure.
They
Right.
gotta get 12 hours, but you can get 12 hours. It's hard, but you can do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. This has been another great episode of We're Gonna Need a Bigger Show. Corey, thank you so much for co-presenting today.
Thank you again for having me.
Vitamin Geek, be sure to check them out. Where can they check you out?
On iTunes.
iTunes, Facebook, everywhere.
Facebook.com/Vitamin Geek Podcast.
Right on. Well, for this, We're Gonna Need a Bigger Show. I've been Mike D. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you next time. Goodbye.
We're gonna need a big show. We're gonna need a bigger